you have literature, and even music.
Paul Smith was a talented composer who spent the majority of his career at the Disney Studios. He received 8 Academy Award nominations, won an Academy Award for his work on Pinocchio. He could write everything that was needed for a score. He could write the original material, arrange it, orchestrate it, conduct it, and he did all of those things at the Disney Studios. An interesting side note, in Fantasia, you can see a violinist, which is Paul Smith. He played violin and he played piano.
A sweet, gentle, quiet gentleman with great talent, because he wrote so beautifully, but he wrote to service the film. He didn't write to service his own ego. Never were aware, oh, there's music going on, although it was going on. And it was wonderful because he made every scene come to life with his gentle magic in his true life adventures where he excelled, he shined in those things.
There were a series of wildly popular films that took footage shot ostensibly in nature, and it was primarily the underscore that drove these movies and gave them certainly a depth of emotion they wouldn't otherwise have had.
I get the melody, first of all, just as a lead line.
Paul Smith felt that his music was a way of drawing the audience into the film, and one of the ways he did that was with melody. His scores are very melodic. A number of Paul Smith melodies were turned into songs, but they just didn't gain the popularity that other songwriters got at Disney.
On polar caps we set our traps for walrus, bear, and seal. We fill the zoo with caribou. Depends on how we feel. Oh, we bring them back alive. We bring them back alive. We don't know why we catch them, but we bring them back alive.
Music at the Disney Studios seemed to play a much more integral part in the making of the movies than at other studios. Paul Smith came to Disney's around 1933, 34. He'd been called in by Larry Morey, who said they're looking for composers. So as an audition, Paul Smith orchestrated and arranged some music that Frank Churchill had written for a Pluto cartoon. And at that point, he was in for the rest of his career. He started assisting various composers on short cartoons where music came first and the animation followed. And working with the animation director to work out on an exposure sheet the exact frames.
All right, do your stuff.
It was a mathematical science to determine just where the music should match an action in the animation.
In the old days, pictures were laid out, animation was laid out to beats. Da, 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 da. The animators will feel the pulse.
And one of the things that Paul Smith and other folks working at the studio tried to do was to free up the music so that it could speed up and slow down and didn't have to be rock solid in a steady rhythmic pattern. Paul Smith said that you could write some very dissonant music to express the chaos and what Snow White is going through. But what he'd learned at the Disney Studios was that if the music was too complicated, you'd alienate the audience. Scare them, but not too much. For the early features, Paul Smith talked about how each character had a theme or a leitmotif, a little musical idea. For example, there's a scene where a message comes from the Blue Fairy in Pinocchio, and you don't actually see the Blue Fairy, but you hear her music. So you know that she's there, at least in spirit. Not only did they use leitmotifs, but there was a lot of catching of action. The idea of musical gestures that catch an action on screen became known as Mickey Mousing. One of the dangers of Mickey Mousing is that it can outwear its welcome, and one of the great things about Paul Smith is that he knows just when to use it in the film to heighten the comedy and to point up, in this case with Peter Lorre and Kirk Douglas, their friendship.
I didn't play just for action. The action was caught within a melody. That's the dressing on a melody.
20,000 Leagues was one of his finest pieces of work. It was a majestic score. It had great scope. It went from the big, exploding feelings to the very subtle, gentle things, to scary things, to eerie. He did a remarkable job in that film.
And there are huge stretches of the film where it's nothing but Paul Smith's music and those amazing visuals. In 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, Paul Smith makes enormous use of two basic musical ideas, and he varies each of them innumerable times throughout the course of the film. The first is Captain Nemo's theme. It was actually written to a piece of poetry that Hazel George, who was the studio nurse, you can see lyrics credited to Gil George. That was her pseudonym at the studio. She wrote lyrics for a great number of his songs.
A lot of my words never materialized as anything except something to help Paul, especially
20,000 Leagues.
He called me and said, see if you can write a poem or anything that might give me a kickoff on this.
Hazel George jotted down the phrase, "Deep is the mighty ocean." Deep is the mighty ocean. And that became the basis for a theme that represents the ocean and the depths of Nemo's soul.
Far better that they think there's a monster and hunt me with harpoons.
He modifies the oceanic or Nemo theme for moments of attack. In order to achieve the underwater effect with the orchestra, Paul Smith used a combination of low strings and low woodwinds, up to 5 clarinets, piano, harp, gong, and bass marimba, an unusual addition to the orchestra.
There's no sea monster big enough to ever frighten me.
The second theme is the song that Kirk Douglas sings.
A lovely little song that was written by Norman Gimbel. He wrote the words, and Al Hoffman wrote the music.
I swear by my tattoo.
Paul Smith uses that theme whenever Ned is on screen or there's like comedy. But it also represents Ned at his heroic when he saves Nemo. We hear an inebriated version of. So the theme shows up in a number of guises, no less than a dozen times. And so what could have been an isolated song that doesn't have any other connection with the film now becomes an integral part of the film. Paul Smith's working technique would have involved, after he'd spotted the film with the director, going off and writing sketches based on timings that he had gleaned from completed sequences of the film. He would take a blank piece of leader and place it into one of the gates of the moviola. And then using a grease pencil, he would make marks on the leader to match the action of the picture, so he knows how much music he needs to write to cover that particular action. For 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, Paul Smith wrote over an hour of original music. Immediately upon the film's release, letters started coming into the studio asking, what is the piece of music that Captain Nemo plays at the pipe organ? It is the Toccata and Fugue in D minor by Johann Sebastian Bach, having been used in Fantasia. It was pre-recorded, was a gentleman by the name of Wesley Tortolot, so that James Mason could have a recording of it. And even though he doesn't play a musical instrument, he learned how to match the music on the keyboard, and Richard Fleischer said that he got a letter from an organist saying, that's the best fingering I've ever seen of the Toccata and Fugue in D minor. The console of the organ is still around and can be seen at Disneyland's Haunted Mansion at the far end of the ballroom. After 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, Paul Smith continued to work at the studio, providing scores for Pollyanna, Perry, Shaggy Dog, a long and fruitful collaboration.
When I first came to work as a staff songwriter at Walt Disney Studios, which was 1960, this wonderful gentleman was working on the score of a film that we had written some songs for called The Parent Trap. And it was the one and only Paul Smith. He wrote great music.
His last two scores were for Ida, the Offbeat Eagle, and The Three Lives of Thomasina. Paul Smith was born in 1906 and passed away in 1985.
Paul Smith's legacy to the world of film music is vast. It's in the archival collections of everyone who loves Disney movies, because so many of them are his. And he lives in his music. He will always live.